welcome to another Feature Fridays episode. And today I'm joined again by Jorg. So, Jorg, welcome. Do you want to give a brief introduction for those who are first coming to Feature
Yeah,
Fridays and haven't met you before?
my name is Jörg and I work as a technical product manager in VMware's Cloud Solution Business Unit.
Thanks, Jorg. And my name is Guy Bartram. I'm Product Marketing Manager for the Cloud Director suite of products. And today we're going to be talking about object storage extension and some of the new capabilities which came out with 2.0. So why don't we start at the top and let's just briefly go over what is object storage about at a very high level, how it fits in with VCD, and then we can dive into some of the kind of provider and tenant capabilities and what's new in 2.0.
Mhm. Yeah, so object storage in general is a way to store so-called unstructured data, which means you don't really have any relationship like in a regular SQL database, but it's really objects, be that files, be that images that can be used in an application or just files that are used for a homepage, or in a Cloud Director environment, you could also use it, for example, as a backend for catalog files, for your images, as a target for backup and disaster recovery capabilities and synchronization. So there's a multitude of different use cases how you use object storage in a data center.
Yeah, and it's pretty good for it's like you said, unstructured data, but also for media files and things like that, very large data sets. One of the great things about object storage is the metadata and tagging of the data, which enables you to kind of do fast search across object storage buckets and retrieve, that data pretty quickly if you need to. But yeah, it's great for service providers because it's you've then got your fast solid state drives, your spinny disks, and now you've got object storage, which can be on Cloudian, can be on Dell ECS, and also AWS S3 object storage service, which is providing you different tiers of capability, addressing different use cases for different types of customers and different verticals as well. So let's talk about the VCD kind of play then. This is 2.0, which has been out for a little while now. What was new in 2.0 that was, I know we had Cloudian and Dell ECS before. Was there any more additional vendor capability and support that was brought in 2.0?
Yeah, so in Object Storage Extension 2.0, it also now supports native AWS S3 storage as a backup. So that's very interesting, especially for more some MSP play where you also have strong relationship and a backend with AWS as a storage provider. And we also introduced a new API called OSIS, which allows other vendors to create their own connectors into object storage extension to have their storage systems as a backend for OSE as well.
So that's cool. So customers could use their own existing S3 buckets in AWS and connect those through to their VDC.
Yeah, it's not really the customers' S3 buckets, but it is provider managed, but with different options for access management. So the idea is that really as a service provider, VCD is the endpoint that you offer to your tenant, and your tenant can access then not only their virtual machines that they run in their organization VDCs, but also the storage buckets through the VCD portal, or of course through API access. And then the backend is managed by the service provider.
So essentially, it's the service provider's S3 account. Is that correct?
It is the service provider's, let's say, build S3 account for the object storage, but when you configure it on for the individual tenants, there are different options. You could either have some shared service level accounts that are being used to access the S3 bucket, or you can use on a per tenant level, create some new users for each tenant, or even import existing S3 users. So import the users that a tenant might already have with AWS.
Okay, cool. And you mentioned OSIS, so this is more of a new common API layer to integrate with Cloud Director at the S3 level. Is that right?
Yeah. So Object Storage Extension publishes an S3 compatible API through the Cloud Director API, which is used to consume the bucket. So you can upload the objects, download the objects, access them, define the metadata and all the settings around that, like additional features and role-based access control, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And as a backend, Object Storage Extension then talks to the actual system where the data is located, and that could be now the existing vendors that we have in the program, like Cloudian, Dell EMC, or native AWS S3. But with OSIS, it is now possible for other storage vendors as well to create a connector into Object Storage Extension so that their storage systems can act as a backend as well for OSE. And we do have a reference implementation, which I can show you later in an open source format on a GitHub repository that, for example, uses Ceph as a storage backend. Ceph is an S3 compatible, Linux-based open source storage system, which is very heavily used as a backend for cloud native apps. And we have that as an example and a reference implementation for these connectors. So service providers can either use this reference implementation if they already have a Ceph installation in their data center, and other OEM partners or storage vendors can use that as an example what they have to implement to create this connection between their storage backend and having OSE provide the S3 capable or compatible API into BCD.
So this is cool. So not only now have we got then native S3 support with AWS, the tenant can use their account there and reuse that in terms of accessing their S3 storage. We've now built in more functionality into our S3 coverage, so getting a lot closer to kind of the full spec of S3. And using OSIS, we're now providing a reference implementation, like you said, of Ceph. So essentially, if you're offering a dev-ready cloud or developer services today, now you can offer this kind of Linux-based S3 endpoint to your developers as well. And then obviously you've got all of the cool features with S3, such as things like object lock, bucket encryption, and all those new features that we brought in.
Yeah, that's correct. So Object Storage Extension, as an extension to VCD, is all about giving the choice for the provider what backend they want to use, and then sort of merge these different backend capabilities into VCD as the single UI portal and the single entry point, API entry point for the consumer, for the tenant user. And with the different scenarios and the different use cases that we talked about to use these storage buckets, for example, for catalog items as a backend for any backup system that uses S3 as a backup destination, or really to have the storage buckets used in their own applications, in their cloud native applications. That really allows a provider to have the biggest flexibility if they want to use some more out-of-the-box storage endpoint, which is typically less operational overhead for them from Dell or Cloudian, or if they already have some AWS sort of business that they can reuse for the AWS backend, or if they are more in a rather build on their own way than buying some other solution, and they have the corresponding skill sets to install and operate a Ceph installation in production, then they can use that as a backend as well.
Brilliant. Okay. All right. So let's have a look. How does this? Should we start with the configuration? How does the provider start configuring these new capabilities?
Yeah, we can see that. So let me switch over to my demo environment here.
All right.
Okay. So I'm logging in as a provider administrator into the provider portal of Cloud Director. We do assume that Object Storage Extension is already installed and set up here. So technically, Object Storage Extension itself is a component, middleware, well, Java-based component that you install as an RPM file on a supported Linux distribution, so typically a CentOS or Red Hat Linux. And it, when you install it, you configure the backend and the credentials to access the backend, like Cloudian or AWS or Dell EMC, and then it registered itself as an API extension into VCD and also uses the UI extensibility that we have in VCD. So it's another good example for where our own extensions that VMware provides use the same frameworks and the same API capabilities of VCD that you can also use as a provider or a third-party vendor.
So here's a question for you. Can I have multiple different types of object storage endpoint?
Yeah, so when you configure object storage extension, you can selectively activate or deactivate the different endpoints and sort of mix and match whatever you need for your environment.
Cool.
And we can see in the, I went to the More menu to object storage, where we can see the provider level setup for the extension, where we will have a list of the different tenants that are configured in VCD. We can see the storage platform, where I now have just AWS installed and configured with the different backend URLs from AWS. If you would enable Cloudian or Dell EMC or Ceph, you would have some more tiles here with the details of the Cloudian backend, for example. And then
what's the normal button there showing? It's green. Does it mean it's reachable and available?
Yeah, that's just the status of the backend.
Okay.
And then for the section, for the settings, you can define some these cross-origin resource sharing definitions, which define over which URLs the buckets should be available or accessible to the tenant. And that's very interesting because that's also, is part of the whole business model around object storage extension, that when a tenant accesses the buckets, they access that through a URL that is part of your cloud provider installation and your cloud director installation. So it sort of course, it's API access, so it does not really use your branding, but it's still your URL as a service provider within the URL. So that it's a sort of consistent access to the resources that the tenant gets from you as a provider.
And does it automatically do that and set that up for you?
That's something you have to provide the DNS wildcard entries. We will see that in a second when we look at the tenant bucket details. That is something that you as a provider have to set up, but then object storage extension takes care of mapping the URLs to the individual buckets and the different backends.
Cool. Okay.
Okay. So as a provider, as usual in VCD, you can enable or disable the different functionality really on a per tenant base. So you can we can see here the status. I've just enabled it for now to for one tenant. If we want to enable it for another tenant, that's where you really sort of define which tenant should use what storage backend capabilities. And you can also select for AWS what strategy you want to use for the access management of the underlying backend buckets. So it is possible. Yeah.
Sorry, can you have different, I know you can have now different object storage vendor types in terms of the plugin and support across multiple tenants. You can have, whichever one you're using or multiple. But for an individual tenant, could I have different bucket types as well?
That is something you cannot mix as far as I know. So for one tenant, for one organization, that's where you select the backend.
So it's done at the org level, not necessarily the VDC level. Okay.
Yeah, for the S3 as a backend, there are different strategies you would use for the account management. So you can invite an existing AWS account from the tenant to be used to access the buckets. You can either create a new account for this tenant or reuse or share existing accounts that you already have from a provider level. So there are different options which are also explained well in the setup guide, because for that to work, you have to create some certain role definitions in the AWS, so that object storage extension with the provider service user is allowed to create these new roles and invite new accounts into the storage organization. And depending on the settings here, you would define these new steps with the account email and so on, and then object storage extension talks to AWS to create the proper user roles, and then the functionality is enabled for the tenant user.
So you don't actually have to go to AWS, set this up as the, I know in one case a tenant, and bring that detail back. It'll automatically do it for you via the API.
That is correct. Yeah.
Cool.
So there's no need. You just as a provider, and not for configuring the tenant access, but just one time during the setup of the object storage extension itself during the configuration, that's when you go to AWS and provide these privilege definitions so that object storage extension can do the certain tasks. But these steps are very well documented in the installation guide of OSE.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's pretty much it. One other thing to keep in mind, as usual, since object storage is UI extension as well, you can have the customize portal extension where you define which tenant should have access to which UI extension, and that's where we have the object storage extension, and you can again publish or unpublish that for individual tenants, which allows you to, well, depending on your business model, to really upsell the capabilities, or for tenants that do not have or that you don't want to have access for OSE, you can even just hide the plugin in the more menu so that they don't even see the object storage and don't get any error message that they don't have access to things they are not aligned to or allowed to use.
Yeah.
Okay. With that, let me very quickly switch over to the system where object storage is running so that we can see the backend. I'm going to share the connection to the console. So that's a console of I think a CentOS box where object storage extension is installed as an RPM package, so pretty straightforward to install it. And then you get these OSE command line tools that have a whole bunch of different commands to manage and configure object storage extension itself. So first we can see the status of the OSE service itself. So that's running. So somewhere in backend there's a daemon running that represents the OSE platform and implements the functionality. And then we can also have all the config validate. We can see the current config, and here you can see the different systems that and the connectivity that is needed for the backend system. So in my case, I just have AWS as a backend, so you can see there's different Amazon services where the connection has to be done. We need a connection to a Postgres database where object storage extension itself stores its configuration, and since the service itself is accessible through HTTPS, you also have to provide a certificate for the HTTPS encryption.
And this is all done as part of the binary install, is it, that database?
That is part, that's part of the first time installation once you install the command.
Okay.
And then we can also see with the platform, in my case, you can see currently AWS or Amazon as a platform is enabled. Cloudian and ECS is not enabled. That's where you would have these other, for Cloudian and for ECS, these other commands to enable and connect OSE to a Cloudian endpoint, for example.
So sorry, just to go back to that database, from a point of view of availability and backup and management, is there any routines that are available to provide, if there is a database failure or database
Mhm.
corruption, is there any backup and restore mechanism for this? Is this
There's nothing specific to object storage extension. It just sort of follows the same part of any database backup and restore that you would do.
okay?
However, object storage extension itself, you can put a load balancer in front of the object storage extension boxes, not only for availability, but also for scale out architecture, so that you can have multiple just OSE middleware components serving the requests from the tenants.
But essentially, you're still going to have one database, or
Yeah,
yeah,
they
okay.
are connected
There's no
to the
high
same
availability
database.
for database, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, with that, let's see the look and feel from the tenant perspective. So let me switch over to the browser again, and I'm going to log out as a provider. I'm going to log in as a tenant admin into the tenant portal as a tenant where, of course, object storage extension is activated from the provider.
Yep.
Here we can see the current, the tenant portal with the different organization VDCs and the virtual machines that are running there. And one thing I just want to show, the libraries that we've seen here, where we have a list of VApp templates and different catalogs, because that's interesting later as well. So we have catalogs defined as regular VCD catalogs, but there's also one catalog already that is backed by object storage extension. And we will come back to that in a minute. Okay. Yeah, for OSE, it is in the More menu where we can have the object storage access here, the UI portal. And here we can see, well, as a tenant administrator, there are a whole lot of things that you can do. First of all, you can see the different sites and organizations where object storage extension is activated for. So OSE also works in a multi-site environment where you would where you can access sort of the, different VCD installations and different sites, and you have different organization VDCs all under one umbrella of the same organization, and OSE reflects that and allows this cross access in the same way as VCD or VDC access would work.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we can see, let's go quickly to the settings, just some general settings where you can set up the server-side encryption. That's one of the new features that we have in OSE 2.0, which can be used to just define the automatic encryption as a, for the storage buckets. And then, we have the buckets themselves where you can create them and define them. So here already a few buckets are created. You can create, let's do a new Feature Friday demo bucket, where you then selectively enable the different other S3 capabilities that we have, like the enable versioning for the bucket and object lock that you can enable with the different levels here. And since we have since we have S3 as a backend, they have to be unique in S3 as well. So that's a S3 definition. So but
so just taking through. So object lock is a new feature. As far as I understand, object lock is really gonna, once you turn it on, anything you write to that bucket will then be completely locked and can't be edited unless you turn the object lock off. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's one functionality of the S3 backend, which is sort of for auditing or things that you really don't want to change. Could be also as a backup destination if you want to avoid any backup corruption, for example, afterwards. And there are different retention modes that you can define, either some governance mode that there are specific permissions, users with specific permissions who can sort of unlock the objects, or if you just a root account or a system administrator should be able to unlock the objects, or if they should not be able to be unlocked as well at all. Which is sort of the strictest one.
And the versioning, what's the versioning about from?
Yeah, so versioning is that whenever you write a new version of an existing object, it also stores the old version as well.
Oh, okay.
That's a functionality, well, of S3, of the S3 API, and the access and object storage extension also supports that. And depending, of course, on the backend, that's both of them obviously increase the storage capacity that's used for the object.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah, let's see the buckets that we have here already. So I do have just some demo buckets available where you can use them just as a data store, so I can upload files, can create folders, and for the files I can see the different versions of the objects and delete them again through the UI, which is typically not really the scenario how you use these object storage files. What you also can see, that's a more interesting part, are the properties. And here you can see, well, the S3 compatible URL to access this particular storage bucket. And you can see here, I have a wildcard access for this, well, S3 and cloud03.11.com. And that is sort of my provider URL that also reflects the URL of VCD itself.
Okay, nice, yeah.
And that's where you, sort of create in the wildcard DNS entries, and then object storage extension takes care of having that properly set up. And that's also where you define, well, different additional settings for logging, for tags, encryption, and so on.
So the encryption would require some sort of key management, I'm imagining, from in this case, this would be a tenant encrypted, so they'd have to provide the keys.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the goal here. So that is something where the tenant provides the keys, either from an external KMS key management system or an S3 system.
And if it's a KMS, then that KMS would need to be reachable from the customer organization. Be within
from the OSE backend.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Okay. We also can define some additional ACLs, access control lists, and permissions, where we can define which of, that's pretty familiar with all kinds of object storage, where you define for different types of access, authenticated users, public, like everybody, if they should be able full control, which is a bad idea for public, but read of bucket might be if you want to publish some catalogs or some items to be used by external systems directly.
And those user roles, they're not roles in context of VCD roles. They are S3.
These are really S3 roles. Yeah, that's correct. Okay. And then we can having these S3 URL and the settings in. It's not really in the users. That's the users of the application in of the organization, just to be shown here, which user have how many buckets and objects they use. But if we go to the security credentials, that's where you define the S3 access key, so which is typically an access key and then a secret shared key that shows up if you click on that key symbol. And these two you can use to access the bucket through the API.
Right.
So let's do that. Let me stop sharing here and share another S3 browser tool.
So just while you're doing that, the so from a metering perspective, I mean, there's some high-level stats there around the number of buckets, etc., being used, and number of objects in buckets. Is there any integration here with vRealize Operations tenant app?
We don't have any integration with tenant app yet. So the you would have to use the metering capabilities of the storage backend when it comes to capacity and throughput.
Okay.
Yeah, so for S3, there are a lot of freeware tools available that act as just a file manager for that. Here I have a free S3 browser tool, just yeah, to show the capabilities. If I show the storage accounts, do you see that pop-up window?
No, I don't. No.
Okay, then get that as well. There we go.
There you go. Yeah.
So
yeah.
the account window, and then if I edit that one, that you can see now.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The account name, where we have the same URL that we saw in the for the storage bucket in VCD, and the access key and the shared access key to be used for accessing these the storage bucket. In the advanced settings, which do not show up, can share in a second.
Yeah, I see.
Advanced settings. Okay.
Signature,
Yeah. So it's signature version 4. That's just a standard. How the some detailed header details for the S3 compatible API. So you need to set that to version 4 so that it shows up.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you can. Oh, yeah. Let me share that again. In the storage accounts. Yeah, then you can use that, and the S3 browser then accesses the storage endpoint and shows the different buckets. So we here have this demo bucket. We have the bucket for the catalog item. We'll talk in a minute, and some additional bucket that's used. Just I uploaded a JPEG file here just to show that you can use that browser in the same way, and it accesses the bucket through the S3 compatible APIs.
So as a tenant admin, I can obviously set up buckets for my organization. Maybe catalogs like we're going to cover in a minute. But also I can then, can I give my developers access to be able to create buckets, their own buckets, through the VCD API rather than doing it directly in S3?
Yeah, so these things that we've seen here for the bucket creation, they are part of the S3 API itself. So they are available through APIs as well, and they follow the same sort of model. So we can define these additional access credential controls. When you have that set up, then the tenant users can use these buckets and create the buckets through APIs.
Okay, so there's kind of two choices there. It's like if you've got an organization that doesn't have any DevOps function or any application transformation initiatives underway that require S3, you can set up some static S3 buckets for whatever the application might be. But if you are an organization with developers in who want to use S3, then you can give them the APIs and the access rights to be able to create their own buckets and do what they want.
Yeah, that's correct. And the API, there's no special API documentation for that because it follows the regular S3 API.
S3, yeah, got it.
For creating and managing the new stuff. Okay, then let's see the other functionality that we have here. So there's one more thing where Object Storage Extension has a way to directly capture existing vApps that run in your org VDC and put them onto a storage bucket. So that creates an additional a bucket that's just used internally in OSE for managing the vApps. So you can capture them from the VCD organization, where you now can see all the different vApps and VMs, vApps that you have in the storage, and then you can add them and capture them to the storage bucket, which is sort of a poor man's one-time backup because they now get exported from the running state, from the running data store to the object storage backend as well.
I was going to say, did it have to be powered off for that to happen, or is that done more powered on?
That I don't know, but let's try.
Yeah.
So likely, I guess they have to be powered off.
Powered off.
Yeah. They have to be powered off. and then
Right.
you give them a name and capture that from the data center, which I'm
That's
not
quite
going to do
useful.
right now.
There was a limitation of 10 at one
That's
time.
just at one time. Yeah.
All right, so you can bulk 10 at a time.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm. And yeah, from there you can also sort of import them back and share them, which is a way for these individual VApps. Once you have them in the object search, it just creates again one link to the OVA file, and then you can access that OVA file through the public S3 compatible link.
Got it. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
that's quite handy.
and then we have the catalog integration. Now that's where you really can create a complete VCD catalog that is backed by object search extension. So you remember where before I've shown in the libraries this CC02-OSE catalog. That is the catalog that is actually backed by object search extension. And here we can see, well, sort of the raw items that make a VCD catalog, which are these JSON files, small JSON files with the metadata around the catalog, like the catalog name and which individual items are part of the catalog. And then we have for each catalog item, here I have two Photon OVAs for the different Photon versions, where we have, well, the JSON file for each item, and then the actual data, when we go in here, it shows, well, the VMDK file, OVF file that makes the whole OVA template. That's part of this catalog.
So would you consider this, because obviously pulling that amount of data out of S3, you're going to get charged on egress charges for that. Would you consider this more of a backup for catalogs?
Yeah, it might be, well, a backup for catalogs, or it might be interesting if you really want to share and publish catalog across different, otherwise not really linked environments. The nice part is here, you can, well, publish the catalog, and that catalog, you can see it's now this from my cloud 03 OLM URL, the URL with a password that you can use to access this catalog. And this subscription URL is compatible with other VCD installation, as well as with vSphere content library installation. So you can have that catalog also sort of published into another vCenter, PDATA VMC on AWS vCenter, or any on-prem vCenter as well, which is an interesting way for certain scenarios just to transfer information. Of course, as a service provider, you have to keep in mind the capacity and especially the transfer rates that you're paying to AWS if you use AWS as a backend. The situation, of course, is different if you use your own Cloudian, Ceph, or Dell EMC storage, where you don't have these transfer costs usually. Then it is really a very valid option just for storing the VCD catalogs to keep them away from your usually more expensive online VCD data stores.
Yeah, and if you're using CDS as well as VCD, this might be an interesting way, because obviously you can upload into S3, and then from a Cloud Director service in VMware Cloud and AWS, that would go out of S3 via the ENI into CDS, so we wouldn't have any egress charges on that, so you could keep catalogs in sync that way, which is a good way to keep your services supported and offerings consistent. And I can see this being very useful for, again, developer community where you've got kind of smaller, smaller catalog items and images rather than, entire, this is our gold build, which is like 60 gig or whatever it is for a Windows machine. I could see that being, if particularly at an application level, I could see this being quite useful.
Yeah, and the big benefits are that it's really well stored on the object storage backend, where depending on the storage vendor, you might have some smart tiering of storage, so more cost efficient than your online data store, and it's independent from the VCD provider VDCs and the catalog, the catalog management sort of in VCD, where you have to have the org VDC having to have access to the underlying data store where catalogs are stored and so on. So it creates a more flexibility for certain use cases.
Yeah, definitely. It's nice to have that external kind of storage which
Mhm.
is generic across any environment. Yeah.
And as an end user who just consumes the templates, there is no difference. So I can see the in the VApp templates, we can see the Photon sort of
Oh, I see. Yeah.
templates in the same way as any other catalog item. So there's no difference here uh, in
So
the
could be
consumption.
quite could be quite dangerous if you do have very large images up there
Mhm.
to be pulling those down all the time. But yeah, good piece of functionality. Just use it
Mhm.
wisely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, is there
Okay.
any more around the 2.0 functionality to see?
Yeah, so we have one more thing that's
Okay.
more focused for different set of users. We mentioned this OSIS framework that
Oh
can be
yeah, yeah.
used for other external vendors to act as a storage endpoint for object storage extension. And that is something where we have the in the VMware samples repository on GitHub, we have the object storage extension samples repository. And this one contains, well, the SDK or that framework that you need if you are a storage vendor to make your own storage system compatible as a backend for object storage extension.
Hmm.
And it also contains the reference installation for Ceph. So Ceph is a common open source storage architecture or storage system that provides an S3 compatible API. And this reference implementation allows you, well, as a service provider, to connect object storage extension with a Ceph installation that you already might have.
So is it fair to say that from now on, it's probably going to be if vendors want to create their own plugins, this is not going to be something that necessarily VMware is going to get involved in, as we've now set up this whole object storage framework.
Mhm.
It's there to be used, and we've got like Cloudian, Dell, and Amazon, some of the big players there already. And if there are vendors out there, they can use this framework to create their own support with
Mhm.
VCD. Okay.
Yeah, and it's technically, well, the same code that is used for the other
Yeah.
connectors as well. So it uses the same functionality, and we just open source that to make it possible for other vendors as well. Of course, you still can get in touch with our Alliance team to get your storage system well certified and run them through the certification that it really
Yeah.
acts as a supported backend.
And this isn't going to give you the UI components, right? This is just literally working on the actual functionality that can be
Mhm.
provided. Yeah, you still
Yeah,
got to do a UI extension.
if you want to do the management of your own storage system through VCD as well, or you want to offer that as a storage vendor, then you would have to do your own UI extension.
Yeah.
However, if it's just a backend that's just intended to be used as via object storage extension, well, you get the the integration sort of for free, because again, as a tenant user in the um, object storage extension UI plugin, I don't really care about what backend it is. That's part of the provider to set up
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to define.
Got it.
For people or for service providers who are interested in the Ceph implementation, as part of that repository, we have that Ceph reference implementation. And if you want to give that a try, well, there are some steps needed that you have to do. So you need a Java installation and a Cradle build system to compile this reference implementation. And the reason for that is that depending on the capabilities of the backend of your Ceph installation, you have to sort of configure that in the source code here. So if we go to the resources folder here and have a look at the S3 capabilities. So here's all that list of functionality that the S3 API sort of provides or defines,
Hmm.
and different Ceph versions or different Ceph installations, depending on what architecture you use, might provide these capabilities or might not provide these capabilities. And depending on your specific installation for the Ceph backend, you might activate or deactivate them in these files, and then also provide the properties for accessing them.
How just out of interest, I mean, I know Cloudian claims to have like the most compatible closest coverage to the actual S3 functionality and API. How much do you think, in your experience, that Ceph offers in terms of coverage, let's say, of S3 functions?
Yeah, Ceph is, I think, the most common open source S3 storage backend. So it has a pretty large community and is used by a lot of, well, third-party open source companies as a backend for storage, or also for cloud-native apps. So I think it also has a very broad support for the S3 functionalities that are defined in the APIs.
Okay, cool. Great. It's a great option for providers to offer this out to tenants who want, a cheaper version, or their own version to play with.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep in mind, of course, that you as a provider then are responsible for installing and running, operating the Ceph installation. But if that's something you already have, because you might have a business department that's focused on, I don't know, Linux open source services or cloud native apps, then that's a very good option for you also to integrate that into VCD as well.
Yeah. And how close do things like some of the application launchpad, like the machine learning and stuff like that, some of those applications, how close are they aligned to, potentially utilizing these S3 services that we can now provide?
Yeah, so that is a very good question. From an app launchpad perspective, there's no real integration needed, because it's mainly based on the applications that are running inside the virtual machines that you have in the app launchpad catalog. And if they consume or can consume S3 as a storage backend, then that is something that you can absolutely provide through object storage extension. The more interesting part is the integration for container service extension. That is something we are working on for the next version of object storage extension, so that you can use the OSE provided storage buckets as a persistent storage backend for the Kubernetes clusters that are deployed through container service extension. So that's something that you would currently have to set up manually. So as a tenant user, if you use container service extension to deploy a new Kubernetes cluster into your org VDC, you then would manually have to set up a persistent storage with any generic S3 storage backend and use the storage bucket from OSE for that. And we plan to have a more tighter integration that you can just, when deploying the Kubernetes cluster, you can directly select the OSE provided storage bucket as a backend. And then the container service extension configures all that setup and configures the services into Kubernetes. So it's much easier to consume that.
Now this is, let me get this right, this is native Kubernetes, right? This isn't Tanzu, or is it?
Well, it is native Kubernetes, but we look into the integration with Tanzu as well. Then,
okay.
It becomes a bit more complicated, mainly because of the network connections between the Tanzu clusters back to OSE.
Okay, got it. All right. Well, listen, Jörg, that's been brilliant. Is there anything else to cover before we close?
No, I think we're good.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, listen, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, it's really good to see it coming together, and there's certainly, I think, some nice features in 2.0 which are really kind of needed, particularly around things like encryption and object lock. I know those are two very popular things. So great to see. So thank you so much for showing us around as usual. And hopefully service providers now have got a good overview of what OSE is all about and where it's going.
Yep. See you next time.
Cheers.